Hey everyone, welcome back to Apologetics. Super pumped you're joining us. Today I have John, the counter apologist. Today we're talking about all things God and miracles. So John, what's up, man? How you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me. I
Yeah.
appreciate coming on. Merry Mario Day Eve.
Merry Day Eve. One question for you before getting all the heavy stuff. One of my friends texted me like 10 minutes before we did this and said, "Are there more chairs in the world or more wheels in the world?" So what would you say, John?
Chairs or wheels?
Chairs or wheels? You have to get the right answer here.
I'm gonna. So many things can count as a chair, or maybe so many things can count as wheels. So I don't.
More
I'm
doors or wheels?
agnostic.
Sorry, I just butchered it. Doors or wheels? Wow.
Doors or wheels?
Yeah.
Oh, geez. I have. I'm agnostic. I guess doors. I'll guess doors.
You lack a
Maybe.
belief.
I lack a
I
belief.
think
Yeah,
wheels. And so do my friends now. We convinced one of our guys. They're like, "No,
it
dude, you're
could
dumb.
be.
It's
So many
it's
things can
wheels."
count as a wheel, right?
That's like
So
think about
many
all
things
the
can count.
cars that every child has that they play with. Like that all adds up. So
It's true. No doors on
tough
them
stuff.
on those Hot Wheels.
So today, besides we're talking about doors and wheels, we're gonna talk about like God and miracles and all this fun stuff. So, John, do you want to tell us a little bit about like who you are and what you do before we get into all this heavy stuff?
Sure. My name's John. I go by the pseudonym Counter Apologist. I've actually been doing this almost 10 years now. I am a Christian apostate and I am an atheist, and I am an atheist in the sense that I believe there is no God. So I'm not one of those lack belief theists. I defend the position that there is no God. And basically, I was a Christian until I was about 28 years old. I was actually raised in a very fundamentalist kind of a world. I went to private Christian school, young Earth creationist schools, no less. And then in college, kind of fell away. Went back into the faith. Got married in the church and was a trustee. I was very heavily involved as the main the main sound guy for the church. I was like the first one there, one of the last ones to leave. I did a lot of volunteer time. I became a trustee towards the end, and then I have a deconversion video. It kind of goes over all of the different problems that like led me away, that led to my becoming an atheist. And then I did not like. I tried to go back because I had a lot of family pressure, and apologetics ended up like kindling a love of philosophy that I didn't really have before. But it drove me away from the faith ever more. Like I was like, these arguments are not very good, and I didn't like a lot of what I saw. There's obviously some very good resources, but I wanted to make resources for people who were deconverting like I was. And so
Mhm.
that's what made me create the Counter Apologist channel.
And I really enjoy your channel. Like I'm not deconverting, but like I really enjoy listening to your videos and like we've responded to some stuff which really sparked this conversation on like miracles. And like I found your channel very edifying, very fresh, and I enjoy your takes because you're not just like going after like low hanging fruit, but you're really like spending your time like thinking about these things like thoughtfully and carefully. So I'm really grateful for your channel.
I appreciate that. Thank you. I did watch you and Bram. You did make me feel like an old man, you little whippersnappers. But you got a high school kid taking apart my video. But
Mhm.
it was definitely fun to watch.
That's
So
Bram. Bram's a real youngin.
he
But
is. So are you, but that's fine.
so today we're gonna talk about miracles. So maybe it'd be helpful, like John, to start things off. Like, how would you define what a miracle is?
So this is actually a very hard question, right? And it gets
Yeah.
super contentious, but I don't quite understand why it gets so contentious. So I am a fan of David Hume's definition, and it seems conceptually clearest to me. And he says that a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature. And in a lot of arguments trying to counter Hume, and there is quite a lot of ink spilled on this, they really go after his definition. Um, and I don't quite get why, because it's just a very basic concept if you boil it down. Because you could try and do this a lot of different ways, but ultimately, is that you need the regular behavior of the physical world to be well established in order for a deviation from that behavior to count as a miracle, right? You don't
Hmm.
eat a whole bunch of Taco Bell nachos Belgrande and then go on the toilet with stomach problems and then go, oh crap, it's a miracle, right?
Hmm.
That's expected. It's part of how nature works. But if someone rises from the dead or walks on water and makes water into wine, that's a miracle that doesn't physically happen, right? That seems to be the core of it, right? You need to have some kind of regularity that is interrupted.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great way to start things, John. Maybe like I'll say my definition. Maybe you can say if like you can agree with it or not. I kind of like to think about it as like the idea of like a miracle is an event that wouldn't occur if God didn't exist. It's a little vague, but then I like for me like one of my problems is I don't like the whole supernatural natural thing, and that gets into consciousness, and we don't need to get into that. Like it's just very messy very quickly. But like for me, like I think about it like where we have an event, and if an event wouldn't occur if God existed, then that would be like a miracle if God didn't exist. So like if we have some sort of event, like say like someone's like healed of cancer or like their cancer disappears. Let's say that like if that event wouldn't have occurred if God didn't exist, then I'd say that it's a miracle. I'm a little choppy, so does that make sense to you, John? Are you tracking? Do you need me to clarify?
I see what you're saying. I think there are some problems with that,
Mhm.
right? So like you're kind of like we're exploring like the phase of like the metaphysically um so you know what? Maybe my definition has the same problem. So I was going to be like, well, what about magic, right? So like, there's
Mhm.
non-theistic supernaturalist views that would be like, well, magic would do
Yeah.
this, but
Mhm.
then that would kind of be a violation of the laws of nature. So it would also be a sort of a
Yeah.
problem for my view. So I think it's fine. I kind of just think of it as like so miracles. Like this is we had a couple of questions to kind of cover, and so like one of
Mhm.
them was like you get into like how you know when a miracle occurs. Part of the problem would be like there's any act of God that is, even if it's in accordance with the laws of nature, because sometimes cancers spontaneously do go into
Mhm.
remission outside of religious context for an atheist,
Mhm.
that sort of a thing happens, but God didn't necessarily do it. God could have just caused someone's cancer to go into remission, and it would have been a
Mhm.
miracle because it was improbable. So there's like physically impossible miracles, and then there's improbable miracles, right? And
Mhm.
so that's no less miraculous if God actually acted, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
Than the physically impossible sort.
Mhm.
So
I
it,
think
it
this kind of
gets
gets
it gets.
into
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
no, I was gonna say like I think this gets into like the Wittgenstein where he talks about how like there's no like perfect definition of like a game that we can give. Like there's no all-encompassing definition that can define a game, but like, we have a general sense of like what a game is. For example, like
Right.
what's behind you. And I think we could say a similar thing about miracles, where we both have like a general sense of like what a miracle is, even if we can't have like that perfect definition that satisfies every situation.
Yeah, and I think a lot of like, especially like you got to be careful with philosophy that you don't over if you get too specific, right? Then you
Mhm.
almost like rule things out definitionally, right? So like you can easily start setting things up to like beg the question one way or the other. And
Mhm.
so I do think like the core of a concept is that it is something that has to be outside of the regular course of nature or like very unexpected at a minimum, right?
Mhm.
So like you have to have the regularity of nature before you get into something extraordinarily happening at the behest of an action of God, basically.
Mhm. Yeah, that's super helpful. Thanks, John. So maybe at this point it might be helpful to look at like when would you say that we could say that like a miracle occurred?
Right. So this is where the problem gets in, right? Because even if you define
Mhm.
miracle, how do I know it happened, right? And
Mhm.
so then you have um, the improbable and the impossible, right? The physically improbable and the physically impossible. And what actually gets even worse here is that there's an inherent relativism of epistemology that comes into play. So it comes into like whether it's rational to say a miracle happened and when it's rational to say it's not, and it could be the same exact sort of a thing.
Yeah.
Randall Rouser has a great. He's written a ton about this, and he speaks about how like he could give you a story of a an event happening with like a missionary in Africa, like getting through customs when he was getting blocked because of somebody who was from the village he was sending medicine to that had an expiration date, very rare. And like both an atheist and a Christian theist could look at that exact same improbable event and make opposite conclusions, and both of them
Mhm.
be rational based on their prior background beliefs, right? So my objection, my video that you and Bram had responded to about this, basically says the only way you can really know if a miracle occurred it would have to be of the physically impossible kind, right? So it
Mhm.
has to be something just we know physically can't happen, right? And then it needs to be something that you can verify that it actually occurred, right? So like if I was an apostle at the time of Jesus and I witnessed him die and then I have him come back and start talking to me, that's an empirically verifiable miracle. flash forward to ascension into heaven. I got stories written 30, 40, 50 years later, right? And I've got basically 5 pieces of testimony at best in the New Testament saying that this happened. Well, that's very different. Like even the verifiable sort fade into the unverifiable kind, right? As time passes, unless you get into like weird persistent miracles of like rocks floating in space spelling out like Yahweh is God or something.
Yeah.
So one of my thought experiment was empirically verifiable, repeatable miracle. So a Catholic priest and only Catholic priests can turn water into wine when they say a prayer, right? And like you could do this in controlled conditions. You could do this before somebody's ordained or after they're ordained, right? And like go through like as empirically verifiable as science can make anything empirically verifiable. You can verify that God was performing a miracle in a specific context, right? And that's how like that's the one way I can think of for sure, like how I would know. But I think there's actually a second way. So you got me thinking about this. So
Yeah.
this is like a new thought experiment, right? So like it actually every time I try to come up with this, it comes back to Hume, right? And so Hume's quote is, "No testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish," right? So if I had, so like let's say we have like pick a Christian, national Christian, some people with a national Christian audience, and they prophesy and they go, God is going to send a sign to all the Christian apostates around the world on Saturday, right? And like Atheist YouTube has a field day, right, laughing about this. And
Yeah.
then we have all of a sudden that Saturday, a huge amount of dead Christian friends or relatives reappear to the Christian apostates. Somebody like Ron Reagan and George H.W. Bush shows up, and they go on TV addressing the National Mall, and they're having conversations with you that only they could have. They're telling you about heaven. They're giving you the correct answers to certain theological questions, right? And then you have this mass worldwide conversion, right? So there's people like me who have atheist channels who've been established for a long time. Matt Dillahunty, like pick people, right? My camera's going fussy. They would basically
Yeah,
I
your
might have
camera
lost my
is.
video. I think I might have lost video. Sorry.
Oh, he's back.
I have to tap it. Apparently it just started breaking tonight. Anyway, all of these people like bring out their they bring out this testimony. I convert, right? So I have this channel and I'm talking about my conversion. I'm talking about my experience. I got a selfie with my grandma, right? So I get all of this and like it's all documented. And I have like all of this documentary evidence from thousands of people around the world converting about this crazy event. It's documented in newspapers everywhere. So even like 100 years, 200 years down the line, like the falsity of that event happening, right? Given all the testimony I have and all this crazy conversion and everything else, it would be more astounding that the event didn't occur compared to whether or not then we have this testimony than the opposite. So like that would be like one way, which is like a massively widespread, empirically verifiable miracle happening, but like being extraordinarily well documented.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I'm tracking with you. And feel free, like if your camera's being crazy, you can just turn your camera off if you need to. It's up to you. I'm gonna miss seeing that beautiful beard. But do what you gotta do, John. But like so thinking about your testimony, not your testimony, your story, I do think that would be like an example of like here would be a miracle. It'd be really hard to like go against saying that like, oh no, God doesn't exist, or there's no miracle that happened here. Surely someone could make some sort of explanation, but it's probably not gonna be a very good one. So maybe one of these things I wonder then at this point, John, is like, do you think this is necessary to like establish to like says a miracle occurred? Like, what about like maybe like ordained testimony? Like, like you'd run into, and I'm sure you know a lot of people from your past who would say, I've experienced God, there's been a miracle in my life. Are those kind of things like if they add up, do you think they could be sufficient to warrant like belief in miracles? Yeah, where are you at on this?
I really don't think so. Because so there's like so in my video, the one thing I go around is there's like different types. So there's the improbable, and then there's the unverifiable miracles, and then there's the impossible, which can be unverifiable or verifiable, right? And you have there's let's just start. Let's just start with the basic categories of miracles. I have got so many different kinds of miracle claims from a
Mm-hmm.
huge variety. Basically, almost every religion under the sun,
Mm-hmm.
alive, current, and dead, have had miracle claims. Testimonial, unverifiable miracle claims of the improbable and impossible sort, both, right? And I have no instances of the verifiable, impossible kind that I can witness, right? And it just seems all too convenient to me to be like,
Mm-hmm.
well, because it's just as easy for God. God is omnipotent, can do all things logically possible, right? So to tell me that all of these different religions that teach contradictory religious teachings, right, um, all have the same sorts of miracle claims, equally or better well attested, and I have none of the contemporary experience of which God could trivially do, right? It seems more likely to me that these other things are just misunderstandings or being people being misleading or those sorts of things rather than not. And I think this gets into, and so like a lot of my critique is based on the resurrection argument, right? Which
Mm-hmm.
is kind of, it has an evidentialist assumption baked into it, right? It's just like,
Mm-hmm.
here's this evidence that a miracle happened, and if this miracle happened, it is evidence for the truth of the theological teachings of Jesus, right?
Mm-hmm.
And therefore you should become a Christian and follow his theological teachings because his teachings are validated by the miracle, right? That
Mm-hmm.
is, and it's a completely evidentialist argument to convince a non-Christian to become a Christian, right? I
Mm-hmm.
mean, if I am I saying something all untowards here?
I maybe just repeat a little bit. I'm tracking with you. I just want to make sure we're on the same page, John.
Sure. So the resurrection argument, right, is there to is to present evidence to convince me that a miracle occurred, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then the underlying assumption, the conclusion of that, is that the miracle is evidence for the theological truth of the miracle of the theological truth of the teachings of the miracle worker. So I should become a Christian because Jesus Christ rose from the dead.
Mhm. Yeah, I think
Right.
that'd be probably right. Obviously, you'd have to do some more steps. I think if you're gonna like lay that out, like if I was making that argument. But I do think like generally, like when I think about like the resurrection, like if the resurrection, like the historical event, then we have a miracle. And if we have a miracle, we have to think about like, well, what does that symbolize? Is there any like religious significance like behind that, or is it like potentially like a miracle? Like I think there's like I allow for the possibility, and I'm sure you know, like you've listened to these videos, that there could be like miracles or supernatural events in other religions. But I wouldn't say they're truth. They would provide evidence for like that specific religion, because I think you have to look at like the religious context and like what is this miracle? What's it trying to prove? Like, are we thinking about like demonic beings or like God, things like this? And there's a lot obviously that could be put in here, and I'd encourage people to check out that response to really get into it. And I know you're inching to say something here.
Yes. So I kind of get I'm really taken aback whenever
Mm-hmm.
I hear a Christian, and you certainly are not the only one I've heard. Even theologians like Randall Rouser, I would greatly respect. Right, a lot of people who defend the resurrection argument, well, like I can fully grant that miracles happen in the context of other religions, and
Mm-hmm.
to me, that is the absolute death knell to the resurrection argument. Like that
Mm-hmm.
is the kiss of death. It is inescapable, like just kills the argument completely, because the argument is there is that these miracles are evidence for the theological teachings of the miracle worker, right? When
Mm-hmm.
you watch these debates with these crazily high paid apologists, right, and they're like the philosophers of PhDs, and they go through like the like steps of like, you know, the cosmological argument, moral argument, teleological argument, and then they always end with the resurrection, right? And it's there to be like, does the Christian God exist, or is Christianity true? It all centers on the resurrection debate, right? On the resurrection
Mm-hmm.
argument. And if you say that, like, once you've admitted supernatural level deception, so like demons or Satan or the devil or whatever you want to call them, can perform miracles like God can, now you have no objective way to determine which miracles are there for the truth, to establish the truth of what God's true religion is, and which ones are supernatural deception, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have obliterated any evidentialist case, right? And that is what the resurrection argument is part of an evidentialist case to become a Christian. every
Yeah.
piece of apologetics I've ever read or
Hmm.
seen, that is like a cornerstone of it for Christianity. And
Hmm.
the minute you allow supernatural deception, I think it's the kiss of death. You're just done.
Yeah, there's a lot, obviously a lot here, and some parts I agree, some I don't, obviously. So I think maybe one thing to think about here for me is I don't think of it as like deception. So remember, like I'm not saying that like so like say like I'm a Christian, I don't think that like necessarily like God is working miracles amongst Muslims to convince Muslims that like Islam is true. I look at the idea of like God allowing for like spiritual other spiritual beings to exist, which is a very biblical idea. Like I think it'd be really hard to like argue against like the idea of like demons or things like this if you like believe in if Christianity, where God sort of allows these beings to exist and they may perform like certain like events or miracles. You could say like events that wouldn't occur if atheism is true. I don't even know if I'd
Sure,
say
sure.
miracles. So then in that sense, like I don't really see it as deception. Then we have this question of well, like which ones are the true ones, which is what you bring up. And I think again we have to really dive into specifically like the religious, the miracles that look at like the center of like religious claims. So we look at questions like the resurrection, or like did Muhammad have like the word of God perfectly put on him, or Joseph Smith, did he like get those tablets the right way? And looking at specifically like the miracles that like religions like hang and fall on are super important when thinking about like well which religion is true once we get into like this kind of aspect of things.
Right. So I'm not saying that God is necessarily doing the deceiving, but I think God allowing other supernatural beings to perform what we would call a miracle, which in this case you kind of call like magic or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the names, the being behind the miracle happening actually is what sort of matters. We're just calling it miracle as a generic sort of a thing here, right? So
Yeah.
like yeah, you've got tons of evidence of this in the Bible, right? So you've got Moses when he went to Pharaoh, he threw his staff down on the ground, it became a snake, and then the Pharaoh's magicians did the same exact thing. Except
Mm-hmm.
Moses' snake ate their snakes as like some kind of a Dom power play move, I guess. Um, but like the magic still happened, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
there's still their gods did things, and so I think that, but you still have essentially what it is that it's like it's there to show like my God has power, right? Is what the
Mm-hmm.
miracles are done, especially in the Old Testament, where you see other magics being worked, right? And so the when you say, well, like if the miracles of Joseph Smith happened, right? Is that not God validating Joseph Smith's teachings, right? And
Mm-hmm.
ironically, there are Christians who witnessed Joseph Smith's miracles who say it was from the devil, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't see how in the world it's possible to look at like if you admit that a miracle happened in each of these different religious contexts, which one came from God and which one came from an evil spirit, right? I
Mm-hmm.
just do not see any objective criteria that you could possibly put forward, especially given the nature of like religious religion informing local moralities, right? So if you're in
Mm-hmm.
a heavily Muslim area and they talk about you know, like all of a sudden you like judge the teachings of Muhammad. Well, if your local moral sensibilities are premised on Islamic law, of course they seem more moral. Hell, those Christians
Mm-hmm.
can drink alcohol. Those monsters, right? And so like all of a sudden these things like get judged in a different way, right? So like you have this relativism problem, I think, and everybody just gets to say, well, their miracles are from the devil. And like I just don't see how you do it.
Hmm. Well, I think this is part of like where it's really important to like look at like the arguments. Like you have to go beyond like I'm willing to say like for like individual like I for a Christian I would never say that like you can't like take your religion for anyone. You can't take your experience of the world and come to like conclusions because each one of us is really like when we're forming judgments on like God and the nature of the world, we're really going a lot off our experiences. So our experiences are super important. But I think it's in Harold Netland's new book on religious experience. He talks about this idea of like a critical trust model, and I don't want to get too much into like religious experience, but like we have this idea that like if the religion is true, then we have reason to believe that like our like perceived experiences are like reliable. So for example, like if we had reason to think that like if you have like reason to think Christianity is true, you'd have reason to think that like your experience of God or miracles are like from the Christian God, and like maybe like Islamic ones are false or demonic. And the same thing could be applied to like Islam. Like if you had a reason to think Islam is true, that'd give you some reason to think that like your experiences or miracles are like from actually God. So then I think to me, like it's the question then of like, well, which religion seems to be true? And you have to look at beyond mere experience and really get into like the nature of like the arguments that we have on every side of the debate. So that's at least how I see things.
So, I mean, yes, in the sort of world of religious epistemology, one of the things that comes up, especially like on Alvin Plantinga's sort of reformed epistemology,
Mhm.
which is particularly pervasive, um, is that your background beliefs, like you're rational based on like interpreting, if you're a Christian because you had testimony from a trusted source like your parents that Christianity is true, it is rational to believe it on that basis, actually, right? That's at
Mhm.
least on his view. And so you would interpret Christian miracles as uniquely true, and Islamic ones as not. And this is why I say I go after the resurrection argument and not the resurrection wholesale, or even the rationality of belief in Christianity or any other religion, right?
Mhm.
Is that if you're going that route, then the you can't the resurrection argument doesn't make any sense. You can't say, well, I'm a Christian, so therefore I believe the argument for the resurrection and not the argument for the miracles of Satya Sai Baba, because the resurrection argument is there to convince you that the resurrection happened,
Mhm.
right? And like
Yeah.
you wouldn't, so you can't. What's doing the work is the properly basic belief in Christianity, not the actual evidence in the argument for the
Mhm.
resurrection.
Yeah. Well, I'm not necessarily like even a fan of Plantinga's way of thinking about these things. It's just to me like, well, if Christianity is true, or like insert any other religion is true, then you'd have reason to think that like your experiences of like the divine or like miracles are actually like vertical. They actually come from like God or things like that. Um.
So I guess the problem with that there is that I think there is definitely a problem insofar that that, and this was even for me when I was a believer. I was like, well, I have these religious experiences. I had these emotional responses to church worship services, and the problem with that is everybody else has them too. Every other religion, contradictory religions, have them true, right? And so if all of these people earnestly tell me that they have this kind of sense of God talking to them when they're having their religious worship, right?
Mhm.
And it's so universal, regardless of what the religion is and what the religion teaches. Well, then that tells me that humans just have a propensity for this sorts of things when they put themselves in these worship situations. And it's far more likely that there's some kind of just a natural psychological response, especially given that you can have like hucksters or like people induce this sort of a thing. Like there's people who will do like magic things or like fake kind of revival things. It's like cold reading and that sort of thing. There's a bunch of atheist videos about it, but there's a guy like in the UK who was like famous for like doing this, and he was just like, yeah, man, at the end, he's like, yeah, man, I'm an atheist. Like, here's how I did
Mhm.
it. And he goes through it. And that seems to me a far more plausible explanation for my own experiences when I compare it to everyone else's around me. Right. So like
Mhm.
that seems to me that even if there is a sense, like a sensus divinitatis, so to speak, that it's not a reliable faculty. Right.
Because
That
of the diversity.
because of the diversity. Right.
Mhm. Yeah.
So yeah, go ahead.
So maybe I give my take and I'll let you respond to that, John. But like the way I think about it is like say that like we're having like there's a play, like we're all looking at a stage and like and this is the very imperfect analogy, but here's how I kind of see things. Say that like the Christian sees like a monkey on the stage, the Muslim see that there's like a tiger, the Hindu says there's like a cat, and the atheist says no, there's just nothing on the stage. You guys are all see you're all different, you're just wrong. It seems like to me to say that since these would like these different views would be contradictory, it seems to me that we wouldn't necessarily say that like well there was just nothing on the stage. We just wouldn't have a good idea of like what it was. There'd still be something. So for example, like when we're looking at like different like religions and different claims of different kinds of miracles, and they may like be contradictory. To me, it seems like the best conclusion isn't that they're just like all false and that there's nothing, but that there's still something there. Maybe it's not a good argument to get from to a specific kind of something, but it seems to me like well, there's still good reason based off of like miracle claims or religious experience to think that there's something happening.
So I think this gets back into the framework that I had before where we're talking about like this is where like the numbers game kind of works against you, I think. And this
Hmm.
is indicative especially of like Mike Lacona. This is how he likes to argue it. If you watch him do the resurrection, he likes to just go and he commits what Paul Draper calls philosopher of religion, atheist philosopher of religion, Paul Draper calls the fallacy of understated evidence. So he takes a general fact that supports his view, but he ignores the specific fact that undermines it. So he talks about like near death experiences and like prophetic dreams of like dream of somebody who died and went to hell who was non-Christian, and the person actually died at the time the person had the dream. It's very
Hmm.
specific stories he gives, right? And like money coming in as a result of a prayer to like the exact cent amount, right? And he always gives them in the Christian context. And then when you look at it, you go, well, there's all of these sorts of near-death experiences and all of these sorts of things and all these other different religions, right? And they all kind of have a natural explanation, improbable as they may be, or as embellished as the stories might be, right? But you have this like it's so widespread, and it's such a huge number of these claims. And then I look at all this and I go, if you want to tell me that I have all of these kinds of claims, but they're all of the non-verifiable kind, and they almost all of them have effectively natural explanations, or all secondhand sorts of weird things, and I can't verify it. But God could do the empirically verifiable kind, right? What are the odds, right? Or is it just everybody's kind of misinterpreting things or putting more into it and overactive agency and all that? It seems more likely to me for the contradictory sorts of things. Like, why would a God do that? Especially when all of these religions teach contradictory things, right? It seems much more likely to me that none of them happen, right? So do you either get like all of them happened, only some of them happened, or none of them happened, right? That's logically exhaustive of all the possibilities, right? And so you kind of look at all three of them and you go, well, if you go to the first one, then epistemologically you're screwed from a specific religion context, right? You might say, all right, well, I guess there's something out there, right? But you have no idea what it is. You have no evidential basis to do that. And you start kind of wondering why God would allow this. The sum of them happen. It's only yours that are true, right? Then that becomes a problem of like, well, how do you know? Like, how do you show that only yours were true and not theirs, right? You have no non-question begging way of kind of sorting that out. And then in my case, in the last case, what I think, well, because you don't have the verifiable kind, and they could be like there's just so many that I can't get something that's on video, right, that I could verify, like it was empirically, like I could test, like none of it is allowed to be that. Like, you're kidding me, right? Like, it's trivial for a God to do that. So that's why it seems to me that's what gives a little bit of evidential weight, I think, to the third option, that none of them really are true.
Yeah, and looking at like your modified trilemma here, I'd lean towards kind of the first option, but not in the sense of saying that like God just does miracles in all religions. I would not say that. If you're listening, don't worry, I'm not a heretic Christians. I don't think that. So it's not just because I'm like trying to, it's just like I'm pretty convinced, like, yeah, that's not how things work. I would lean towards some sort of option where we have God working miracles in the Christian faith, and then having like there's like demonic beings and things like this. And we talked about this, so I don't feel like we have to get into it too much further. But that's like when we're looking at like your kind of options, that's where I would lean towards and try to answer this question of looking at like diverse miracles, or looking at like claims in other religions. So
yeah. So I just don't, and I haven't seen very much literature on it, and the little bit I have seen is bad, and I like to point to the moral teachings, right? Is to try and differentiate between like, well, this is why mine are true and yours aren't. And I think the relativism problem happens there. I think even in my own deconversion, one of the key factors for me was that Christianity, in my sense, had a false moral teaching. It taught that same-sex relations and relationships are morally impermissible. And I had gay friends who were as in love as my wife and I are, right? They're married now. They've been together for almost as long as we had. And I couldn't call what they had wrong. I couldn't call their love wrong. So, like, if there's a false teaching and moral teaching in Christianity, and I think that that is, then you're out. You're out the game, right? So, like, if you're going to go the moral route, you got problems with the relativity of morality, and then you're going to get into what is and isn't moral. And if you say, well, it's moral because God commanded it, but here's my holy book that I prove by this miracle that I'm judging is true on the basis of morality, right? You got a big circle problem there, right? And I think morality is the only one I've ever really seen argued for the context once you've like tried to discern between which religions were true and which religions' miracles were from God and which were from like demonic beings or something. I'm not familiar with any other ones. I'd love to hear them. But I don't know how in principle you could give me that argument.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's different people, like I believe John Peckham, who would have like some sort of like extending it even to the problem of evil, this idea of like demonic beings and God allowing them. So there's stuff there, but we don't really have to get into it, I think, for today's conversation. Maybe John, as we're getting closer to the end, like any other like topics or things you want to bring up here before we wrap up?
I think I don't really have too many other topics
Hmm.
specific to it. I just think that I guess part of the big thing about miracles is obviously in a Christian context we're talking about the resurrection and we're talking about the resurrection argument. And I just in the way it's presented, there are two key assumptions in that we'd mentioned this before. It's just that it's an evidentialist case. I'm presenting you with historical evidence, right?
Hmm.
That Christianity, that this miracle happened, and this miracle happened as evidence for the theological teachings of Jesus. Therefore, you should become a Christian. And I think this is sort of at odds with the answer that apologists give to the divine hiddenness argument. And they say God wants to keep us almost at an arm's length behind a veil of ignorance so that
Hmm.
you could choose whether or not to follow God, so that God doesn't make himself so well known and so obviously well known. This is why they say we don't have the empirically verifiable miracles, or at least some responses to the hiddenness argument say this, right? Kind of counteracts what you say with the resurrection argument used in that evidentialist way, right? And I think that historically there's like a sort of methodological naturalism that gets employed. But even if you didn't, all of these relativistic problems with the different miracles and which ones are from the devil and which ones are from God, these all kind of just come to the fore. And so it's reasonable to not believe it or not. And so I think the entire approach sort of is flawed because of the epistemology problems with miracles. And then also it kind of contradicts with certain answers to the hiddenness problem. So
Hmm.
I think that's a particularly hard issue that isn't too often explored.
Yeah, there's definitely something to think about here. We have this idea of like, well, God is hidden, because it allows for things such as like our freedom. Then we have like miracles that happen, which seems to maybe like go against like our freedom or like show like it's very obvious. And to me, like I think it's like I would say it's less about like God being like at arm's length, but more about there being some sort of like ambiguity. So like you could have like God coming like close and intimate and experiencing God, but also having this like ambiguousness, if that's a word. So that's kind of like I think what I would say, but I have to think about that more. So I'm glad you brought that up, John.
I think there is one extra problem, if you don't mind. So
Yeah,
the
go
last
ahead.
issue I think is there's is a it's a kind of like a new sort of hiddenness, and it's a problem for God's love, right? God's supposed to be all loving; He loves all beings equally, right? All created beings equally. And the thing is that if you go to the Bible, right, especially the resurrection itself, you have a small subset of the population, very very small subset of the population who knew Jesus, saw him die, watched him resurrect. They got empirically verifiable miracles, even after Jesus' death. The apostles were empowered to work miracles on Jesus' behalf to show the truth of Christianity. He charged them to go out, right?
Hmm.
And they did it. The Gospels say they did these things. So a small subset of the population got the sort of empirically verifiable evidence that would convince me. I would convert back. Get me the Catholic priest turning the water into wine. I'm Catholic again, baby. All of a sudden, all of these theological answers to the problem of evil that I find so unconvincing, I've got evidence that I'm going to take it now. I'm back in,
Hmm.
right? And so to say that you would give, and like Thomas didn't convert on their testimony. He converted on in the face of the resurrected Christ, right? So to say that God would give certain people the empirical evidence that would convert them, but not others, like me, and there's plenty others, um, I think is its own form of problem of hiddenness and a contradiction with the attribute of divine love.
Hmm. Yeah, there's definitely a whole other hiddenness problem that you bring up here, John. I
Sorry,
think
let me throw this at you at the end. Sorry.
no, I know you're good, man. I understand because this is why I bring you on because I really value like your perspective and you're really thoughtful and things like this. So yeah, I'm glad you brought this up and it's something that probably not gonna respond to tonight, but definitely something
Yeah,
to think about. So yeah,
I'd love to
and
see it.
yeah, definitely. Maybe we can do a whole other conversation on divine hiddenness because I really enjoyed this. And unfortunately, we're running out of time. And it'd be fun to do
Yep.
that maybe. So we'll see what happens. Well, thank you, John, for coming on. Anything else? A third problem you want to throw at me before we wrap up here?
No, thank you very much for having me. Happy Mario Day tomorrow, everyone.
Happy Mario Day to everyone as well. Didn't know it was a holiday till John and I were talking. So, but thank you everyone for tuning in. Super grateful for you coming on. John's channel at Apologist is literally just added in the YouTube thing, so you can check that out. Really great channel, great content. Disagree with him on a lot, but it's definitely like really thought provoking. Is if you enjoyed John here, I think you enjoy what he has to say, and he'll make you a better thinker, whatever side of the fence you are on, or the lack of belief you're on, or whatever. So, yeah, thank you so much, John. Really appreciated this conversation.
Thank you very much. Have a good night.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.